Professor Martin Fougère, Professor in Management and Politics. Professor Fougère, I now invite you to the podium.
Rector, Dean of Research, fellow faculty and staff at Hanken, Hankater, ladies and gentlemen. What I will talk about today for my inauguration speech relates to questions I have grappled with over the past 20 years or so, and mainly since 2007, when I became an assistant professor in economist politology at Hanken. The way I have understood one of my key roles in the business school since then has been that I should make explicit what is political about various business impacts on society. Through my teaching at Hanken, through my research and my partnership activities with various organizations over the years, I have explicitly discussed political implications of particularly the concept of corporate responsibility, often called corporate social responsibility, or for short, CSR. Now, in the traditional mainstream understanding of CSR, CSR is not something that is political. It is usually understood to be deployed in a so-called post-political context, in which governance, in a sense, functions as a market of authorities. In such context, Ronen Shamir has characterized CSR in terms of what he calls the moralization of the economy. In that sense, CSR is seen as a moral duty for each individual corporation in a context where all of us, as individual economic actors or market actors, so for example as consumers, entrepreneurs, or investors, all of us then are responsibilized for the impacts we have on nature and society. You could call this a neoliberal perspective to sustainability, whereby sustainability challenges are to be addressed through the responsible actions of atomized market actors, in the absence of top-down authorities that could govern, legislate, or regulate these issues through other means. Now, within management studies, there have been various challenges to this mainstream apolitical understanding of CSR. Particularly, when examining the historical process that gave birth to CSR, it is clear that CSR was originally a very political project, launched after the Second World War in the United States by business interest groups through a coordinated PR effort involving a great deal of semi-academic contributions, particularly in Harvard Business Review during the 1950s. CSR was very much a reaction to the New Deal and the strong welfare state seen as a threat for business. And the idea was to argue that business self-regulation was the best way to address some of the key societal challenges of that time. When in the 1990s then, CSR was proposed as a global panacea to tackle the grand challenges of sustainable development, it was again driven by large business interest groups arguing for the superiority of business self-regulation over government legislation, at a time when there was a great deal of civil society pressure for stronger regulation of business conduct. So CSR can be seen as a device to drive the legitimacy and regulatory interests of business in contexts where business impacts on society are strongly problematized in public discourse. But CSR, I will argue today, is also a site of politics, a political arena, so to speak. The concept itself has been the target of definitional struggles. While the dominant definitions of CSR until about 2010 were very much in line with the celebration of business self-regulation, a civil society mobilization during the early 2000s led to influential redefinitions. For example, The official EU Commission definition used to call CSR any corporate action that goes beyond minimum legal requirements, a positive definition which contributed to almost all CSR reports pre-2010 being entirely framed in a win-win-win, positive and philanthropic light. In 2011, though, following lobbying from many stakeholders, the EU Commission redefined CSR as the responsibility of enterprises for their impacts on society, making it clear that the most relevant impacts are those connected to the core activities of the enterprises, and that, of course, negative externalities of business activities should be given particular attention. Such redefinitions alone, of course, can achieve little. But the concurrent development of social media at around the same time, giving relatively small watchdog organizations the means to both network and publicize some of their findings broadly, contributed to a much more dialogical CSR process, with watchdog pressure increasingly leading to the necessity of public corporate response. Thus, CSR provides an opening for stakeholders to engage with corporations, and while many CSR activities are framed as partnerships, where mutual interest between corporations and NGOs is typically sought, the accountability mechanisms that are attached to CSR and partnerships allow potential adversaries to have their divergent views heard. As an example, with my recurring co-author Nico Solitander, we studied two multi-stakeholder partnerships and looked into how coalitions of actors adversarial to those partnerships engaged in a political struggle over the lack of credibility of the certification standards developed by these partnerships. In the example of the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, watchdog coalitions have sometimes succeeded in making the standard more demanding, in making its enforcement stronger, and even in some cases, they have obtained the expulsion of certain key corporate members of the Roundtable. All of this while acting from the outside, while not being included among the stakeholders involved in the partnership. So regardless how deliberative a multi-stakeholder initiative is internally, its political nature is often more evident in the way external actors engage with it from the outside. As suggested earlier, CSR has largely been about reclaiming legitimacy for corporations in times of critique of business. And we can also witness highly political struggles over the legitimacy of particular goods, products, or innovations from the perspective of sustainability. Still in relation to palm oil, in an article with my colleague Ville-Pekka Sorsa, we studied the process by which palm oil-based biofuels, which were initially deemed legitimate by the aforementioned Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil and as part of the EU's Renewable Energy Directive. So these palm oil-based biofuels were subject to a fierce legitimacy struggle in various arenas of governance. In that article, we drew on different political theories to explicate this legitimacy struggle politically. In this particular case, the EU Parliament in 2017 overwhelmingly voted with 640 votes against only 18 for banning the use of palm oil in biofuels. Although there have still been new developments since, and the political process over the legitimacy of palm oil-based biofuels is not completely over today. But political, it very much has been and remains. Additional evidence of the political nature of CSR relates to the fact that today many CSR processes have become subject to not only soft law, but also national and regional legislation, particularly at the EU level. With three colleagues from Hanken, we have studied the Finnish multi-stakeholder coalition Ykkösketjun, which lobbied successfully for the inclusion of a Finnish law on human rights due diligence in the Finnish governmental program. This is an example of collective action that is clearly political, not merely a partnership implementing a project of mutual interest. These new types of engagement between civil society watchdogs and business can be seen, I would argue, as a natural development which follows logically from previous CSR-related engagements. And in fact, our research shows that dyadic pressure response relationships that were established between watchdogs and corporations years earlier were leveraged as a foundation when forming the Ykkösketjun coalition. So CSR is political in at least all those ways I've talked about. Now, in the title of my speech, I refer to responsibility not only in relation to business and CSR, but also in relation to business schools. What do I mean when I move to that context? Well, in the first instance, what I mean is that there has been a legitimacy crisis here too in the business school. Back in 2008, with the global financial crisis, business schools were criticized as institutions which supposedly contributed to the crisis, and key business school stakeholders, such as accreditors, business ethics networks, and large students' associations, vowed to responsibilize business schools. An initiative going in that direction, which we have been engaged in at Hanken since its inception, is the United Nations Principles for Responsible Management Education, or PRIME for short. My partner in crime, whom I mentioned earlier, Nico Solitander, and I have been particularly involved in implementing PRIME at Hanken, but also shaping the meaning of PRIME in the Nordic countries through the Nordic chapter and engaging with PRIME members globally, particularly through the PRIME Champions Network. Now, it is somewhat schizophrenic for me to acknowledge that while I believe there has been much to celebrate in how PRIME has contributed to transform the business school curriculum over the past 15 years, I also see problematic tendencies in what many business schools seem to understand PRIME as promoting. What is particularly concerning is that too often, in line with Shamir's notion of moralization of the economy, which I opened this talk with, responsibility in business schools is only understood in terms of individualized, atomized responsibility of market actors, as seen in all their decisions as consumers, entrepreneurs, investors, leaders, managers, marketers, and so on. Now, there are many problems with limiting business school students' imaginations to these moralized economic roles. Let me focus on two of those serious problems here. First, the problem of the overburdening of the individual, meaning here the student as present and future economic actor. With the explicit responsibility turn in business schools, now the individual gets to be responsibilized and potentially blamed in case of failure, not only for their own lack of enterprise or employability, not only for their inability to contribute to a thriving economy, but also for the lack of sustainability of their individual consumption choices and investment decisions. In our recently accepted article on this topic, Nico Solitander and I call this new business school subject Homo Responsabilis, where the responsibility burden is added on top of those burdens that characterize the well-known figure of Homo economicus. Various scholars have pointed out that the overburdening of individuals as self-managing, self-enterprising, atomized market actors contributes significantly to the contemporary mental health and burnout epidemics. This is a concern in its own right, of course. But beyond these issues, there is a second problem which the overburdening of students as individual decision makers also contributes to: their relative inability to conceive of issues as structural, political, best addressed through some form of collective action. In her work on the consequences of neoliberalism, Wendy Brown notes that when individuals are fully preoccupied with their own human capital, their own individualized economic and sustainability burdens, then they also tend to be deprived of a political imagination. So I want to argue here that it is crucial to keep within the business school curriculum the possibility for students to understand our sustainability challenges as political issues which can be affected through other means than individual consumption choices or investment decisions. Whether we are talking about burnout epidemics or sustainability transitions, We should not understand the solution to these grand challenges to lie merely in technical solutions or in individuals fixing their atomized behaviors in line with the demands of sustainability. For example, expecting them to embrace mindfulness to avoid burnout, or to stop using their car even when they need it for their livelihood in order to correct their individual carbon footprint. The discussion around just transitions, for example, shows that these issues should absolutely be seen as political. If explicit politicizations of these questions of social responsibility and sustainability are missing in intellectual and academic circles, including in business schools, then we will be leaving the politicization of these issues to emergent social movements expressing their discontent, and possibly to far-right populist attempts to appeal to those movements, as in many contemporary examples in the global north. So to conclude, and in line with recent contributions to business ethics drawing on authors such as Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière, I want here to promote the explicit expression of dissensus as a normatively fruitful endeavor. What I mean is that when aiming to advance sustainable change in a way that is balanced between various environmental emergencies and the growing societal demands for reduced inequalities, we should not think only in terms of consensus-driven partnership approaches, because these approaches often exclude the more marginalized groups. Instead, I will argue that we should see dissenting views on social responsibility and sustainability as legitimate. In other words, we should accept that these issues are political and treat them as such. Thank you.